All right, by the clock on my computer, it is 10:15. So if everyone is here, we'll go ahead and get started with the Sturgeon board. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Beal, and I am pinch hitting as the chair for the Sturgeon board. Ross Self is one of the commissioners that needed to stay home to deal with the weather issues. So I will be the stand-in chair for this board. So we can go ahead and jump right in. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? Anything? I have one agenda item under other business. New Jersey, New York, and Delaware want to provide a quick update on an emerging issue that they have, and we'll do that under other business. Are there any other changes to the agenda? Not seeing any. The agenda stands approved. Any comments, concerns, or changes to the proceedings from August of 2018? Is that the last time this board's met? So if you guys, anyone remembers that far back and you remember what you meant to say at that meeting but didn't say it, are there any changes to that? All right, those minutes proceedings stand approved as well. Public comment. Are there any public comments to start the meeting? Anything online, Tony? Any hands online? No hands online. Okay. What's that? Okay. The one thing that we have done with this meeting and the Chadden River Herring meeting later today, which is a little bit unique, is let the Mid-Atlantic and New England Council members know that the presentations for the assessments are going to be made, and they can listen in and answer or ask any questions that they might have. So when we get to the question and answer period for following the presentation of the stock assessment, I'll give priority. We'll handle folks in the board and board members that are participating virtually, and then I'll give priority to council members, assuming I know exactly who all the Mid-Atlantic and New England Council members are, and then we'll go to the public if we have time. So with that, Amanda Higgs is going to give the presentation on the Sturgeon stock assessment update. Take it away, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So as he said, I'm going to be doing the review of the stock assessment update. I want to thank all the TC and SAS members, as well as all the staff from ASMFC that made this happen. So ASMFC's 7 standard terms of reference are also used in the Sturgeon update. As you can see, there's a couple that we're not going to cover, but otherwise we did all 7. The first term of reference is the commercial fishery. So kind of for people that don't know, mid to late 90s, lots of states closed their fisheries. In 1998, there was a coast-wide moratorium that went in place. The historical landings are available in the benchmark 2017 assessment that was done. And in this update, as well as in the benchmark, there was 3 sources of bycatch mortality estimates that were used. So the Northeast Fisheries Observer Program, the North Carolina Estuary and Gillnet Fishery, and the shad, American Shad, South Carolina Shad Fishery. Next slide. So to find discard estimates from the NEFOP data, we used the GLM approach to model the sturgeon take as a function of species mix on a trip, year, and quarter by trawl, sink, and drift gill nets. Species mix was comprised of those caught the most on observed hauls and encountered sturgeon that's found in the ASMFC 2017 benchmark. The selected model for each gear type was applied to the vessel trip reports to predict sturgeon take for all trips from North Carolina to Maine, which is where the NEFOP operates. So the total bycatch of Atlantic sturgeon from the otter trawls range between 478 and 1,187 fish over the time series, which is this table, which is table 1. The proportion of encountered Atlantic sturgeon recorded as dead ranged from 0 to 18% and averaged 4%. This resulted in annual dead discards ranging from 0 to 212 fish. Likewise, the total bycatch from Atlantic sturgeon from sink and drift gill nets ranged from 281 to 1,583 fish, which was table 2. So the proportion of Atlantic sturgeon recorded as dead ranged from 12 to 51% and averaged 30%, resulting in an annual dead discards ranging from 123 to 594 fish. So these estimates that were in the updated model for this assessment were very similar to the estimates that came out of the 2017 benchmark for both these years. Next slide. So the North Carolina estuarine gillnet fishery, the bycatch in North Carolina's fishery reached a height of 1,413 fish in 2015 and a low of 119 fish in 2019, which is table 3. So in general, the bycatch in this fishery has decreased over time, and for years that overlap between this assessment and the benchmark, those estimates are lower in this assessment, which are from database improvements that happened between the two assessments. Next slide. The South Carolina American shad fishery update used the same methods that were used in the benchmark. So it's the number of sturgeon reported, effort, and catch per unit effort. So this data is from multiple DPSs, which is a distinct population segment, which we're going to touch on in a second. The Carolina DPS, which is the Waccamaw, Petey, Santee Rivers, and Winyah Bay, and the South Atlantic DPS, which is the Edisto, the Combahee, and Savannah Rivers. So this is the number of sturgeon reported as incidental bycatch by commercial fishermen fishing for American shad in South Carolina from 2000 to 2022, and shad regs changed in 2013. So next slide. Distinct population segments is the way that Atlantic sturgeon are categorized into 5 of them: Gulf of Maine, New York Bight, Chesapeake Bay, Carolina, South Atlantic. This is figure 1. So the DPS was created by NOAA nymphs and have different physical, genetic, physiological characteristics. The SAS noted that while the surveys in this assessment are categorized this way, some are likely catching mixed populations. The SAS is making the assumption based on some genetic assignments from Kazak et al. 2021 that the surveys encounter predominantly Atlantic sturgeon from their respective DPSs, but some Atlantic sturgeon from other DPSs may be mixed in as well. Next slide. So the term of reference 2, which is the surveys. So as noted in the benchmark, Atlantic sturgeon are not often encountered in fishery independent surveys. So there are 9 surveys that were developed into indices of relative abundance and were standardized using the generalized linear models. Because of low positive tows, several surveys used a binomial error structure that was recommended by the peer review panel in the 2017 benchmark. So here are the fishery independent surveys used to develop indices of relative abundance. The months and models used for the index are listed in addition to the start and end years of the survey. So length cutoff was used for determining if the survey catched predominantly young of year, which was less than 500 millimeters, juveniles that were 500 to 1300 millimeters, or adults, which were more than 1300 millimeters. So next slide. So these are the indices that we used: Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Long Island Trawl Survey, a couple different fashions. Next slide. The New York Juvenile Atlantic Sturgeon Abundance Monitoring Program, New Jersey Ocean Trawl, and NEMAP. Next slide. The Virginia Institute of Marine Science Shad and River Herring Monitoring Survey. Next slide. North Carolina, P135, a bunch of different versions. Some more North Carolina indices. Next slide, which is the South Carolina Edisto River Sturgeon Monitoring Project Survey and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Tagging Cruise, which ended in 2010. So next slide. So this is a coastwide index, so it's combined for the relative Atlantic sturgeon abundance using the Kahn method. The index is variable from 1990 to 2022, but has been steadily increasing since 2013. This is figure 4, which is the time series of coastwide juvenile and adult Atlantic sturgeon relative abundance using Kahn 2010 and 95% credible intervals. Next slide. So term of reference number 4 is a tagging model. We evaluated acoustic tagging from all the sources across this range. We determined tagging location unless there was genetic data that was available. There was a Cormack-Jolly-Seaver model, which estimated detection probability and survival. And then survival was used to estimate total mortality, or Z. Next slide. So the number of acoustically tagged sturgeon varied by DPS and size group. The number of tags greatly increased over the benchmark that was done in 2017, which improved estimates, but the tagging model is still very sensitive to sample size, which notably is in the results from the Gulf of Maine distinct population segment. Next slide. So the overall estimates of Z were similar to those in the benchmark assessment, and in most cases equal or lower. Across DPS's total mortality, or Z, was also similar, although the Gulf of Maine DPS was somewhat higher. Next slide. So the number of tags increased since the benchmark, improving estimates, but analysis is still sensitive to sample size. Tagging studies are often short-term and may not have steady funding. There's a possibility of improving the modeling in the next benchmark, which is slated to happen in 2028, with maintained or increased tagging networks. So we could include covariates or use a finer temporal or spatial resolution. Next slide. No, my computer froze. No. No. Okay, sorry about that. So the ARIMA analysis is a trends analysis evaluated if the last year of the index was above the 25th percentile of the time series, where the last year of the index was above the 1998, which is the year of the moratorium, or first year of the study or survey. ARIMA methods were updated from the last benchmark, and were able to handle missing index values. Next slide. So all the ARIMAs were credibly above their respective 21st percentiles of abundance, except for the Connecticut, Long Island, Trawl Survey, all months, and the Virginia Institute of Science, Marine Science, Shad and River Herring Monitoring Survey in the James River in the spring. The situation was more mixed when considering terminal year fits compared to the fitted index from 1998, or the first year of the survey. So when duplicate indices were removed, the terminal year for 7 of the 16 indices were not above the 1998 value. The last column indicates the results of the Mann-Kendall tests for the ARIMA fits, which is a trend analysis to detect trends. When comparing trends in the ARIMA fits between 2017 and 2024, the results were very mixed, where some indices having no trend now have positive or negative trend. In other cases, positive or negative trends remained the same. For this update, all the indices in the South Atlantic and Carolina DPS have positive trends. Gulf of Maine DPS index had a negative trend, and New York Bight and Chesapeake had a mix of positive, negative, and no trends. Next slide. So term of reference 5 is stock status. So they were federally designated endangered in 2012, and there really remains no estimates of unexploited biomass or abundance at coastwide or DPS levels against which to evaluate the status. Abundance estimates are available for a few of the rivers. So traditional overfished or overfishing designations aren't meaningful for sturgeon. And for this assessment, a qualitative stock status was determined from the probability of the estimate of the total mortality from the tagging model being greater than the Z 50% egg per recruit reference point. So a stochastic egg per recruit model was used to estimate the Z reference point 80th percentile of the Z 50% EPR distribution, and is used as a reference point, and it was equal to 0.14. The methods and life history information used in the analysis were similar to the ones of the benchmark. Another metric used was the probability that the terminal year of the indices for a given DPS was greater than the reference year for each index as evaluated by the ARIMA. Because the available indices only cover most recent time periods, long after the height of exploitations happened, metrics like trends and landings and consideration of anecdotal reports and historical distribution and abundance were used to determine a qualitative biomass or abundance status relative to historical levels. Next slide. So here are the total mortality Z estimates from the tagging model, the EPR reference point, and the probability that Z is greater than the reference point in this assessment for 2024 and the last assessment in 2017. So at the individual DPS level, estimates of survival were lower and estimates of Z were higher due to low sample size and a broader parameter distribution. So it's table 9 and figures 6 through 10. So the Gulf of Maine had the highest median annual Z at 0.15 with 55% probability of it being above the Z threshold. The New York Bight DPS median Z is 0.06 with a 20% probability of being above the Z threshold. The Chesapeake Bay DPS had a median Z of 0.05 with a 14% probability of being above the Z threshold. The Carolina DPS had a median Z of 0.05 with 18% probability of being above the Z threshold. The South Atlantic DPS had a median Z of 0.07 with a 26.5% probability of being above the Z threshold. So overall, the probability of exceeding the Z threshold was lower for the coast and for all DPSs than was estimated in the 2017 assessment. Next slide. So here's our final status summary table. And all the DPSs at the coastwide level, Atlantic sturgeon, were determined to be depleted relative to historic levels, a term that acknowledges the impact of not just directed fishing mortality, which ended in 1998, but other factors such as bycatch mortality, ship strikes, reductions in productivity due to habitat loss. So at the coastwide level, while they remain depleted relative to historic levels, the composite index had a 100% probability of it being higher than the 1998 value and a significant positive trend over the time series, and the probability of the total mortality being above the total mortality threshold was less than 2%. So at the individual DPS level, results were more mixed. The average probability being above the reference year was greater than 50% for the New York Bight and Carolina DPSs, and less than 50% for the other DPSs, which are similar to the results from the 2017 assessment. The Gulf of Maine had a 55.5% probability of the annual Z being above the threshold, but all the other DPSs had a less than 50% probability of exceeding the Z threshold. Next slide. So the final term of reference is the research recommendations and progress that's been going on since the last assessment on these recommendations. So identifying spawning units along the Atlantic coast, significant progress has been made. We now have evidence of spawning in the Connecticut, the Nanticoke River, and Marshy Hope Creek, and have documented separate spring and fall spawning populations in both the PD and Ogeechee rivers. Some populations are still left to be documented, mostly in the Carolina DPS. Next slide. So the next recommendation is expanding and improving the genetic stock definitions of Atlantic sturgeon, including developing an updated genetic baseline sample. So a genetic baseline has been published with 8 distinct groups collected in 13 rivers and 1 estuary. Fall and spring spawning genetically distinct within at least 4 rivers. Some mixed stock work has been done, looking at subadults in the Hudson, which is the composition was similar to historical fisheries. The mid-Atlantic, significant mixing is happening. Coastal environments, there's a high contribution from the highly migratory Ogeechee stock. Mortalities and permitted activities mostly were Hudson fish, but there were substantial numbers from other populations such as the James Fall spawning and the Delaware River. Monitoring surveys for the Hudson are being done, and majority of them are Hudson assigned fish. Next slide. So it's determining habitat use by life stage, including adult staging, spawning, and early juvenile residency, and expanding that understanding to the migratory ingress of adults and egress of adults and juveniles. So research has been done on spawning intervals and occupancy in the Hudson. There is a 1-year spawning size run estimate for the Hudson, which is similar to the estimate that happened in the later years of the fishery. Spawning and migratory cues for the savanna, acoustic and mixed effects modeling, the Great PD, some non-natal use of the Delaware and Hudson rivers, and Cape Hatteras acoustic rays identify seasonal presence. Next slide. Collecting DPS specific age growth, fecundity, and maturity. So there's a published information on growth in the Hudson using hatchery and OTC in the wild and in the hatchery, and the growth difference between spring, fall, and the success of sensitive to the first year of survival. And in February, the Southern Division AFS meeting made a workshop that looked at aging in different species of sturgeon, and ASMFC is still planning to hopefully do a workshop to standardize some protocol for processing and reading later this year, and then doing a hard part exchange along the coast. Next slide. So collecting more information on vessel strike occurrences, including mortality estimates, and identifying hotspots for vessel strikes and developing strategies to minimize the impacts. So ship strikes remains a threat. Delaware did some work on reporting rate of reporting of dead fish is pretty low, 4.8%. The Delaware River and use of Delaware Bay, vessel strikes and habitat disruptions used due to the increased use of the bay. Ship strike mortality in the York River is low and survival is high. Mortality estimates for marine waters in New York and have a late spring hotspot and suggest using real-time telemetry to close the fishery during that time, and wind farm use remains a concern. Next slide. So establishing some regional fishery independent surveys to monitor sturgeon, and expanding existing regional surveys to include annual Atlantic sturgeon monitoring. So some abundance estimates have been completed for the Delaware River using genetics, estimates 125 to 250 adults. The Hudson River using a combination of side scan sonar and acoustic telemetry, 466 adults. York River using marker capture models, annual estimates were developed from 2013 to 18. 2018 estimated 145 adults. Savannah River did some side scanning and mixture modeling, and the maximal daily spawner abundance was 35 to 55 adults, but they mentioned it was not a full census. Next slide. So the last two recommendations are encouraging data sharing from acoustic tagged fish, particularly in underrepresented DPSs. There's a large-scale telemetry project that's wrapping up in 2024. It was funded by BOEM and a large collaborative synthesis that kind of helped foster collaborative relationships, which was kind of a new thing, and happy to see that that changed a little bit over time. And the last one was maintaining and supporting current networks of acoustic receivers and tagging to improve the estimates of total mortality. So continued support of arrays for long-term maintenance is critical for our tagging model and to provide management and relevant insight. So I think that's it. Any questions?
All right, great. Thanks, Amanda. And thank you to the Stock Assessment Subcommittee. This represents a lot of work on a, I don't know if you want to call it data poor, but definitely a data challenge species. It's hard to pull together all these different river systems and all the pieces of information. So thank you for all that hard work. Any questions or comments for Amanda? Lynn and then John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Amanda, for that presentation. I'm just curious if you could elaborate a little bit on that last bullet in one of those last slides that said wind farm use remains a concern. Can you just elaborate on what that means a little bit more?
So I think some of the stuff that's been published is that fish are using those areas, and we're not sure exactly how that's happening. So a concern that they're using those lease areas, and we're just not sure.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Amanda, and all the work that went into this assessment. I was just curious, it seems like the survival is very high, yet the population is growing very slowly. And I was just wondering, I know one of the things we've been looking at is the survival of the young of the year and water quality. As you know, the EPA is working to raise the water quality standards in the Delaware because we think that might be causing mortality of the young of the year. Was that looked at all, like the survival of young of the year and juvenile sturgeon?
So, no, not really. The tagging model is predominantly the subadults and adults, so we don't really have a way to track the mortality on those young of year and whether or not they're surviving to that juvenile or subadult stage. So for sure, that could be a source of uncertainty or difficulty with the population recovery, even if mortality on the adults is low.
I just follow. I'm just curious. Do other rivers have similar DO profiles in the summer in areas that are known nursery areas? I mean, is that a common problem throughout the range of sturgeon, or is this something that's more like a Delaware specific problem?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's something we've looked at specifically from river to river about that, but I think habitat loss, habitat degradation is certainly a concern for all of our anadromous species across their range. And so I don't think, well, we didn't look specifically from river to river at things like that. It's not an uncommon problem.
Other questions or comments about the assessment and the presentation? Nothing online. All right, pretty quiet group. And no hands are raised online, so I think we are all set. We don't usually pass a motion to approve stock assessment updates for management use, but does anyone around the table have any concerns with using this document using this assessment update to inform management discussions moving forward with sturgeon? It's a little unique because we're essentially in a moratorium for another decade plus while the stock recovers. So we won't have any day-to-day management decisions, that's for sure. But seeing no concerns around the table, this will stand as the assessment that will guide our discussions moving forward. With that, I think we move to election. Oh, I'm sorry, Eric. Go ahead, please.
I don't have any questions about the assessment, but my question is about what happens next. The two councils, Mid-Atlantic and New England, did extensive work on how to deal with the condition of sturgeon, and we passed a motion yesterday to do the same thing. So we have a buy-up coming, I think, in January. So I guess the question is, how does the results from this play into that buy-up, and what happens next as far as the three management bodies concerned, depending on the outcome of that buy-up? And I think that's probably maybe for Max.
Yeah, I was going to turn that to a representative from NOAA. Max is online with his hand up, so go ahead, Max.
Hi, yeah. I'm sort of subbing in for the Sturgeon board this morning, so apologize if it sounds like I'm sidestepping a little bit, but it's my understanding that the timeline that Eric, that you just mentioned for the buy-up is right. I think early 2025. I suspect that folks working on that are looking to use these assessment results as part of that buy-up. And I would, I guess I would defer any specific answers to Garfo or, protected resource offices at Garfo or even at headquarters that are running the biops and following the actions with monkfish and spiny dogfish. So I'm happy to relay the question to them or make any connections as appropriate.
Great, thanks, Max. Are there any Garfo reps or others from Protected Resources from NOAA that are on the webinar that would like to add anything to Max's response? Lynn Langshire, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Just to introduce myself, I'm Lynn Langshire. I'm the Sturgeon Recovery Coordinator for Garfo. So I'm not directly involved in the biological opinion that's being worked on right now, but just wanted to to also provide feedback that we certainly are aware of the stock assessment update, and all of that information will be considered during consultation. Thank you.
So I think that's the feedback we're going to get on that question. Max, if you can, oh, Jason Didden has his hand up, so we'll go to Mid-Atlantic Council staff. Jason, go ahead, please.
I guess this is a follow-up for Lynn. So with the next biop, are like the options that the service determines either the actions that were taken are sufficient, or if other RPAs or RPMs, whatever the right verbiage is there, may be necessary?
Right, so with any, I mean, again, we don't have any outcome yet for that, but it's the next biological opinion will follow the same as every other biological opinion. So they will consider all the available information and then make a determination, first of all, whether or not there's a likelihood of jeopardy that would require RPAs, reasonable and prudent alternatives. If there's not a likelihood of jeopardy, then we can provide reasonable and prudent measures, RPMs. And those, of course, have differences in terms of what we can require for an RPA versus an RPM.
Great, thanks, Lynn and Jason. Any other hands up or comments on this discussion? All right, seeing none, oh yeah, Eric, follow up.
I suppose I should say thank you for the answers, but I am going to avoid that at this point. It would be great if we could get some idea in December for the two councils at least, because we have our priority setting procedures in December. If there's going to be something that we have to undertake again after an extensive period of setting up the measures we have in place now, it would be really good if we could find that out in December, because we'll have to adjust priorities based on the possibility of having to do a tremendous amount of work all over again.
Great, thanks, Eric. We also have Ellen Keene from NOAA with her hand up. So Ellen, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to let Eric know I'm Ellen Keene with Protected Resources Division, and I am working somewhat on the biop as one of my jobs. And Eric, we will be presenting to both councils in December. We've asked to preliminarily get on the agenda for those council meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And the other thing that's going on or goes on with Sturgeon on a regular basis is the ESA 5-year ESA review. It's divided up into two pieces, Northeast and Southeast, I think, if I recall right. And James and I think we recall the same, that the Southeast is a little bit newer than the Northeast ESA review. So the next review will be somewhat informed by the work in this the assessment update as well. Any other comments or questions on ESA or biological opinions or Sturgeon assessment updates or anything related to that? Seeing none, we are going to move on to the next agenda item, which is the We do have one question online. James Fletcher, go ahead, Jim. You are.
The third world countries, Russia, Bulgaria, are running sturgeon enhancement programs. Are there any enhancement programs being run along the coast of the United States? Just a question. Thank you. United National Fishermen's Association.
Thanks, James. Look around the table. Are there any sturgeon enhancement efforts going on along the East Coast? Jim, I don't see any hands going up, so it doesn't sound like we do have any activity on the East Coast. There may be some activity on the West Coast, but it doesn't appear to be here on the East Coast. Moving on, seeing no other hands raised, I'll try again. Election of vice chair. John Clark, do you have a motion?
Sorry, give me a second.
It's a look behind the curtain on how things work.
My apologies. I thought I wrote it down, but I can't find it right now. But it is my great pleasure to move to elect Dave Sikorsky as vice chair of the Atlantic Sturgeon Management Board.
Thank you, John. Is there a second? Jim Gilmore. Any comments or feedback on that, or any objection to approving Dave Sikorsky as the vice chair of the Atlantic Sturgeon Board? We should have done that at the beginning, Dave, so you could have chaired this meeting. I would have been off the hook, but I wasn't thinking quick enough. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we do have one other business item. I'm not sure who the spokesperson is going to be for the New Jersey, New York, Delaware emerging issue, but John, I called on you early. I'll follow back up with you.
That's probably why I couldn't remember the other thing. I had this on my mind, but yes, I just wanted to let the board know that you probably have all heard that our 3 states received a notice of intent to sue from the Delaware Riverkeeper for the lack of Section 10 permits for our state water fisheries. And this, after 12 years since it's been listed, it was, I guess, not surprising, but just wanted to let all the states know that this could be coming. And from what we understand, the notice of intent to sue is a 60-day period where I know our states are going to try to let it be known that we are working on the Section 10 permits for our state water fisheries. And if I understand correctly, at that point, then in this case, the Delaware Riverkeeper would decide whether they will proceed to lawsuit or take it as an indication that we are moving ahead with what they want us to do, which is to get the Section 10 permit. But I just wanted to alert the board that we may not be the last of these actions to occur. Thanks.
Great, thank you, John. Any questions for John or the other involved states? Not seeing any. Anything else to come before the Sturgeon Board today? All right, seeing nothing, the Sturgeon Board stands adjourned, and we'll start the Cyanid's Management Board at 11:15, so 15 minutes early for that board.